Let's talk about texture. Now, a lot of people, when they first start drawing with colour pencils, they focus on how to blend. They focus on how to get the pencil down as smooth as possible onto the paper. And this is definitely important, is definitely an important skill that needs to be learned, but so is texture. So today I want to show you a few different drawings that have a variety of textures, and I'll show you how I went about building up each of them. Now, before we get started, if you'd like to learn how to draw any of these 4 pictures, they are all available on my Patreon. Each Patreon video includes in-depth instructions for every step of the drawing, as well as the real-time footage, sketch outlines, details of all of the colours I'll be using, and the reference photo. Do check out the link in the description. Now, there's a few different methods I use to draw different textures, but whatever I'm drawing, I always work from a reference photo. So I always start off with my texture by looking at what I'm going to draw. Now, I work from a reference photo because I draw realistically, and it's the only way to create something that's truly going to look realistic, in my opinion. Certainly it is for me. So let's start off by looking at some fur texture. And I'm going to show you this by drawing a lion. Now, the very first thing that I always like to do when drawing fur is to look for what I think of as the base colours. So I don't like to go straight in with texture. I want to create a reasonable kind of underdrawing that I can then build that texture on. So what I'm doing is trying to look past the texture to the colours underneath. So I'm building up a mixture of some kind of yellows, some pinks, some browns to create the main lights and darks underlying the fur, but not worrying about any of the texture. Now, the main things I want to be doing here is trying to get this as smooth as possible, which is the opposite to what you would imagine. There's a few ways to help make this as smooth as possible. First up, I want to work nice and lightly. It's going to be much easier to get a nice smooth pressure if I work lightly. If I press really hard, it's just not going to be possible to build up all of the texture that I need. To help me press lightly, I'm holding the pencil further back than you would think. So rather than holding it right near the tip, I'm holding it about halfway down the pencil. And that literally stops me from being able to press too hard. The other thing I'm doing is working in circular motions. Because I want this to be as smooth as possible, I don't want to be just kind of shading back and forth with the pencil that's going to make something that looks very scratchy. If I work in small circle or oval motions, I'm going to get a much smoother application of colour. So once I've built up all of the base layers, it looks something like this. And from here, I can start building up some of the texture. So all I'm doing with a nice and sharp pencil is gently brushing my pencil against the paper. Just very, very lightly. Again, I don't want to be pressing hard here. If I press hard, it's going to make really thick lines and it's going to end up looking very wiry. So just very gentle flicks, particularly going in the direction of the fur. So the direction that I can see on the reference photo, not the direction that I think it would be going in. And I literally just work through a lot of the same colours that I did for the base layers, building up flicks with each of these colours, and gradually it builds up the fur texture. But it is something that builds up gradually, so you don't expect to do a few flicks and then it's done. Now, once I've gone over the whole area with the flicking motions, what I then like to do is go back over it with more circular motions to smooth it out a little bit. I do find that if you just go over it with the flicking motions, it again looks a little bit wiry, even if you do it lightly. So going back over it with circular motions just smooths it all out a little bit, but doesn't completely remove the texture. Now, the final thing that I sometimes like to do when I draw fur is go back in with a craft knife. So because you can't put light pencils over the top of dark, it doesn't show up. If you want to put light hairs back in, you can do it with a craft knife. So I'm just, again, very, very gently scraping away some of the top layers of pencil to reveal some of the under layers. So some of those base layers that I put down at the very beginning of the fur. You can see that's just lifting the colour and adding a little bit of extra detail, a little bit of extra texture. Now, this brings me on quite nicely into the snail. So very different looking texture here, but actually a very similar method of going about it. So we once again want to be building up base layers in exactly the same way as we do for fur texture. Working in circular motions, working very lightly, holding the pencil further back so we can press lightly. And once all of the under layers of colour are built up, I can again go in with maybe a slightly darker colour and begin drawing in the patterns of the snail. Now again, I am looking at my reference photo to draw this. It's not a case of trying to get all of the lines in exactly the same place as the reference photo. I kind of find it helps to use it as inspiration. So for example, you'll notice that towards the top, they're slightly more kind of round patterns, I guess. Whereas along the bottom, it's a little bit more kind of lines. And by looking at the reference photo, I'm able to see what texture I need to be building up. I can again go back over the top of this with more circular motions, smooth it out, go over the lines more times, and just gradually build up this texture. I'm not doing anything particularly technical, I wouldn't say. I'm just adding to and adjusting this snail's foot until it matches the reference photo with a mixture of smooth circular motions and lines with the pencil. Light lines again, I still don't want to be making big chunky lines. Now on to our next texture, and I'm looking now at the straw on this nest. Now this, I would say, is quite time consuming and at points a little bit overwhelming. So there's all of these pretty chunky strands with quite a lot of shadow around it. So the first thing that I wanted to do was again put down some very light base layers, looking for the lightest colours and all of those underlying colours. And there was, generally speaking, I would say, a lot of greys and browns in here. I then wanted to just try and mark in some of the darker areas. So rather than looking at all of the details, just mark in where the darkest shadows are. So each strand of straw was surrounded by quite a shadow. And if I can start off by marking in the shadow, it's going to make everything else a lot easier. From there, I just carried on working with circular motions. I didn't actually do any other motions with my pencil because actually the shadows and the pieces of straw were reasonably large. I just focused on one section at a time and really drawing what I could see. So kind of outlining each piece of straw and maybe adding some shading where, for example, this area is darker and this area is lighter. I can add more shading on those darker areas and less on the lighter areas. It is as simple as that, and literally just drawing the shapes of the straw. And by focusing on one section at a time and drawing each shape one shape at a time, it gradually creates the picture of straw. I would say that the key bit is really starting off by getting your bearings and marking in those first few shadows. Now the last thing that I want to talk a little bit about is the bubbles. Again, they are a very complicated looking texture, but I'm still going about it in a very similar way, despite looking completely different to the straw, for example. Although there is one main difference that I will show you in a second with the bubbles. So I can once again start off by building up the base layers, all of these lighter kind of underlying colours. The main thing that I'm noticing about with the bubbles is that they're not all the same colour. Some of them on the right hand side are a little bit more yellow where the duck is showing through. Whereas on the right hand side they're a bit more kind of grey, I would say. But I once again want to begin by marking out the key shapes. So just marking in the main bubbles and again getting my bearings. I find it's far easier if you can do that and then you can build on all of the extra details from there. Once I built those main shapes, I then want to really look at each bubble and work out where the lighter and darker areas are. So once again, I would say that this area is darker and this area is lighter, and I want to be creating that with my pencils. Now the main thing that I want to do once I've gone over all of the bubbles, building up the texture, adding more soft shading over the top until I've got to the point that it kind of looks like bubbles. I'm then noticing that on each bubble there is a very bright white patch, and that is creating the feeling of a reflection. It's what is going to make the bubbles look shiny. I'm actually going to go back over this with a jelly roll pen. This is a white gel pen that can go over the top of pencil. Just like at the beginning when we were drawing the line and I mentioned that I have to go back in with a craft knife to add in those lighter areas, I can also use a jelly roll to add in the white. And it's particularly good on a drawing like this where I want those light patches to be a bright white. So you'll see that whatever texture we're doing, actually the general process is always pretty similar. We want to start off by building up some of the underlying colours, some of the base colours, then start looking at the shapes that are actually there. So whether it's fair texture and we want to be making some marks and flicks, or whether it's more kind of, I'm going to say shape based, like with the straw or the bubbles, we want to begin marking that in, and then we can always go back over the top, smoothing it out and just adjusting and softening what's there. Finally, I can either go in with a craft knife or a jelly roll pen to add in some of the lighter areas and a bit of extra detail. Now, if you'd like to learn a bit more about how to draw texture, specifically fair texture, do check out this video here where I go through it with a lot more detail. Now, as always, happy drawing guys, and I'll see you in the next one.